I'm Dr. Thomas Adams, and for 30 years I served as Chief Medical Examiner for Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 4 weeks ago, I cleared out my office at the county morgue and handed in my credentials, walking away from a profession that had defined my entire adult life. My resume included board certifications in anatomic and forensic pathology, over 7,000 completed autopsies, and expert witness testimony in more than 200 criminal trials. Colleagues throughout the tri-state area knew me as someone who never missed a detail, who could find answers where others saw only questions. Throughout my career, I'd encountered every conceivable manner of death. Elaborate homicides staged to look like accidents, suicides disguised as natural causes, deaths from toxins so rare they required consultation with specialists across the country. What I'm about to describe is the case that demolished my faith in everything I believed about forensic science, and forced me to confront the possibility that some aspects of death lie beyond our capacity to understand or explain. The Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office occupies a utilitarian concrete structure on 2nd Avenue, the kind of building most people never notice as they drive past. Within its walls, we process roughly 1,500 deaths annually using state-of-the-art equipment, digital radiography systems, a comprehensive toxicology laboratory, and 4 fully equipped autopsy suites. For 29 years, those fluorescent-lit corridors felt like a second home to me, a place where science and procedure could answer any question. That certainty lasted until the morning of October 14, 2024, when a seemingly routine case arrived that would transform that familiar building into a place I could no longer bear to enter. The day began without any indication it would be different from thousands of others. I arrived at 6:45 in the morning, exchanged my usual greeting with Glenn Booney at the security desk, and rode the elevator down to the basement level where the examination rooms were located. My schedule showed a 7:30 autopsy on what appeared to be a straightforward cardiac event. Marlene Butler, my diener and surgical assistant for the past 12 years, had already retrieved the body from refrigeration and prepared the suite. According to the preliminary paperwork, the decedent was a 42-year-old white male named David Kowalski, discovered unresponsive in his home by his wife the previous evening. The initial assessment showed no trauma, no suspicious circumstances whatsoever. The responding paramedics had pronounced him at the scene, and the attending physician at UPMC Mercy Hospital had documented a presumptive myocardial infarction. His body had been transferred to our facility only because Pennsylvania law mandates forensic examination for any unexpected death in someone under 45 years of age. I stood at the steel sink washing my hands, glancing through the window at the sheet-covered form on the examination table, mentally cataloging the dozen other cases waiting in the queue that week. This one would move quickly. External examination, standard Y incision, organ weights, tissue samples for histology, routine toxicology screen. I expected to be dictating my preliminary report by 9:30 and moving forward with the next case. Marlene had the surgical instruments arranged in their usual precise order when I entered the suite at 7:28 exactly. The digital clock on the wall displayed those numbers as I pulled back the white sheet and took my first look at David Kowalski. His appearance matched the transport documentation perfectly. 5 feet 11 inches tall, 183 pounds, well-nourished adult male with no visible external trauma. His skin displayed the expected pallor of death, with dependent lividity present on his posterior surfaces, the purple-red discoloration that develops when blood settles after cardiac arrest. Rigor mortis had already passed, consistent with the fact that he'd been deceased for approximately 16 hours. I began my external examination following the same methodical process I'd performed thousands of times, speaking into the overhead microphone that recorded my observations. I documented his brown hair, brown eyes, the small scar on his left knee, the appendectomy scar on his lower right abdomen. Everything appeared completely unremarkable until I opened his chest cavity. The instant I reflected back the chest plate and observed his heart, I felt reality shift beneath my feet. The organ sat in his pericardial sac exactly as it should, surrounded by the lungs and great vessels in their proper anatomical positions. But when I lifted it to conduct a closer examination, I felt my hands go cold despite the latex gloves. The heart was warm, not room temperature, not the cool sensation of refrigerated tissue. Warm, as though it had ceased beating minutes ago rather than 16 hours earlier. I looked at Marlene, who was staring at the organ in my hands with an expression I'd never witnessed on her face in 12 years of working together. "Dr. Adams," she said quietly, "that's not possible." I placed the heart on the scale. 347 grams. Perfectly normal for an adult male of his size. But the temperature was impossible. I'd examined hearts that retained warmth when I'd been called to perform immediate autopsies on homicide victims, rushing to preserve evidence before decomposition could begin. But those cases involved bodies that had been dead for less than an hour, sometimes still in the emergency room. David Kowalski had been found at 7:15 the previous evening. The paramedics' report documented a body temperature of 79.3 degrees Fahrenheit when they arrived at 7:32. He'd been refrigerated at 38 degrees since 9:45 the previous night. There was absolutely no medical explanation for his heart to retain this warmth. I retrieved the infrared thermometer we used for documenting tissue temperatures and aimed it at the cardiac tissue. 94.6 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked it again, convinced the device was malfunctioning. 94.2 degrees. I asked Marlene to retrieve the backup thermometer from the storage cabinet. Same reading. I placed the heart back in the chest cavity and checked the temperature of the surrounding tissue. The lungs, the liver, the stomach. All registered at the expected temperature for a body that had been refrigerated overnight, ranging from 41 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Only the heart maintained this impossible warmth. I need you to understand something fundamental about forensic medicine. We operate within absolutes. Time of death calculations rely on temperature loss, rigor mortis progression, livor mortis development, and decomposition patterns that have been documented across thousands of cases over decades of rigorous research. A body loses heat at a predictable rate of approximately 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour until it reaches ambient temperature. Variables exist: body size, clothing, environmental conditions. But they're all calculable, all scientifically explainable. What I was observing violated every principle of post-mortem physiology I'd ever studied. I continued the autopsy, but my hands were shaking now. The coronary arteries showed moderate atherosclerosis, consistent with the presumptive diagnosis of myocardial infarction. There was evidence of acute ischemia in the left ventricular wall, tissue death from lack of blood flow. Everything indicated a heart attack, a completely natural death, except for the temperature. I collected tissue samples from every organ, labeled them meticulously, and sent them to the histology lab. I drew blood from the femoral vein for toxicology screening. I examined every inch of that body, searching for some explanation, some overlooked detail that would make sense of what I was seeing. The external examination had been completed at 7:53. I'd made the first incision at 8:04. I'd removed and weighed the heart at 8:31. At 8:42, as I was examining the liver, Marlene touched my shoulder and pointed at the instrument tray. The heart, which I'd placed there beside the table, was still reading 93.8 degrees on the infrared thermometer. In the 11 minutes since I'd removed it from the body, sitting exposed to the 67-degree air temperature of the examination room, it had lost less than 1 degree of heat. "We need to document this," I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Marlene retrieved the digital camera, and I photographed the heart from every angle, with the thermometer readings clearly visible in each frame. I called in Dr. Stacy Kaller, one of our associate medical examiners, who was working in the adjacent suite. Stacy had been with the office for 8 years, had trained at Johns Hopkins, and possessed one of the most analytical minds I'd encountered in forensic pathology. I explained nothing, simply asked her to take a temperature reading of the organ on my instrument tray. She looked at the thermometer display, then at me, then back at the heart. "This can't be right. When did this case arrive?" "Last night at 9:45. He'd been dead since before 7:30 yesterday evening." Stacy checked the reading 3 more times. She examined the body, reviewed the transport report, and studied my documentation. "Tom, I don't have an explanation for this. Have you verified the refrigeration units?" We had. Glenn Booney, our facilities manager, confirmed that the unit where David Kowalski's body had been stored maintained a constant 37.9 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the night. The temperature logs were automated and showed no fluctuations whatsoever. The 5 other bodies in the same unit were all at the expected temperature. I completed the autopsy, closed the body, and dictated my preliminary findings, carefully documenting the temperature anomaly without attempting to explain it. The toxicology results would take 6 weeks. The histology would return in 10 days. I sent the samples off and tried to focus on my other cases, but I couldn't stop thinking about that warm heart sitting in a refrigerated body. That afternoon, I met with Dr. James Lettier, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner and my supervisor for the past 15 years. I brought the photographic documentation and temperature logs. James listened to my account without interruption, his expression growing more troubled as I spoke. He'd been a forensic pathologist for 34 years, had worked in New York City during the busiest years of the crack epidemic, had processed victims from plane crashes and industrial disasters. He'd witnessed things I could barely imagine. "I don't know what to tell you, Tom," he said finally. "In 3 decades, I've never encountered anything like this. The only possible explanation I can conceive of is some kind of metabolic process continuing after death. But we've never documented anything that could maintain tissue temperature for that long post-mortem." "What if the body was still alive when it arrived?" I asked, though I knew it was impossible. "What if we somehow miscalculated time of death?" James shook his head. "You documented fixed lividity, absent rigor, corneal cloudiness. Those findings don't lie. And the paramedics recorded a body temperature of 79 degrees 18 hours ago. You can't come back from that." The histology results arrived on October 24th. They confirmed acute myocardial infarction with no unusual findings. The tissue showed normal post-mortem changes. The toxicology screen came back negative for everything except therapeutic levels of atorvastatin, a common cholesterol medication. By every scientific measure, David Kowalski had died of a heart attack, and his body had behaved exactly as expected after death, except for the temperature of his heart. I signed out the case as acute myocardial infarction due to coronary artery disease, manner of death natural. I included a detailed addendum documenting the temperature anomaly, noting that it remained unexplained despite thorough investigation. The case should have been closed, but I couldn't let it go. I started researching medical literature, searching for any documented cases of persistent postmortem warmth. I found nothing. I contacted colleagues at other medical examiners' offices across the country, describing the case in hypothetical terms. No one had encountered anything similar. Then on November 3rd, another case came in. Amanda Peterson, 37-year-old white female, found deceased in her apartment by her sister. Apparent suicide by overdose. Empty bottles of alprazolam and vodka on the nightstand. She'd been dead for an estimated 24 hours when she was discovered. The responding officers noted no signs of foul play. The case came to me on November 4th at 8:15 in the morning. I began the external examination, documenting the lividity, the rigor mortis that was just beginning to pass, the lack of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. Everything pointed to a straightforward overdose case. When I opened her chest, her lungs were warm. Not just the right lung or just the left. Both lungs sitting in her thoracic cavity, reading 96.1 degrees Fahrenheit on the infrared thermometer. The surrounding tissue was at the expected refrigerated temperature. Just the lungs. I felt something crack in my chest, the same sensation I'd felt when examining David Kowalski's heart. I called Stacy Keller into the suite immediately. I didn't even have to explain. She took one look at the thermometer reading and went pale. "Not again," she whispered. We completed the autopsy together, documenting everything with obsessive precision. The toxicology results would later confirm lethal levels of alprazolam and alcohol. The manner of death was suicide, but Amanda Peterson's lungs remained warm throughout the entire examination, cooling by less than 2 degrees over the 3 hours we worked on her case. We photographed everything. We had Glenn Booney verify that the refrigeration unit was functioning properly. We checked every piece of equipment in the suite, looking for some heat source that could explain what we were seeing. There was nothing. I reported both cases to Dr. Lettier, and he convened a meeting with the entire forensic pathology staff, 4 medical examiners and 2 associate medical examiners. I presented the documentation, the photographs, the temperature logs. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who'd been with the office for 22 years, suggested we were dealing with equipment malfunction, but the thermometers had all been calibrated and tested. Dr. Marcus Thompson proposed some kind of chemical reaction in the tissue, but the histology showed nothing abnormal. Every explanation we could generate fell apart under scrutiny. "We need to consider that we're missing something fundamental," Stacy said. "These aren't just anomalies. They're impossible by every measure of post-mortem biology we understand." The meeting ended with no conclusions, only an agreement to document any similar cases and consult with experts in post-mortem physiology. But I was already starting to understand that no expert would be able to explain this. I'd spent 29 years building my career on the certainty that dead bodies follow predictable patterns, that science can explain everything we observe in the examination suite. These cases were showing me that my certainty had been naive. On November 18th, a third case arrived. Thomas Brennan, 53-year-old male, death by massive stroke. His brain tissue was warm when I removed it from his skull, reading 95.4 degrees Fahrenheit. By that point, I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was just terrified. I started having nightmares about warm organs beating in cold bodies, about corpses sitting up on examination tables because some part of them had forgotten to die. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, thinking about all the cases I'd examined over 3 decades, wondering how many of them had harbored these impossible warmths in organs I hadn't thought to measure temperature on. The protocols didn't require it. Why would they? Dead tissue cools. That's a fundamental law of thermodynamics, except when it doesn't. I began taking temperature readings on every organ of every body that came through my suite, documenting measurements that my colleagues thought were excessive. Most cases were completely normal, but 1 in every 20 or 30 cases would show it. A heart, a liver, a kidney, lungs, maintaining impossible warmth long after death. There was no pattern to predict it. Young and old, male and female, natural death and homicide. The organs looked completely normal under microscopic examination. The tissue showed standard post-mortem changes, but the temperature defied everything I'd been taught. Dr. Letier suggested I take a leave of absence in early December. He phrased it gently, framing it as concern for my well-being after processing a heavy caseload, but I could see in his eyes that he was worried about my obsession with these temperature readings, my insistence on documentation that fell outside standard protocols. Stacy Keller was the only one who seemed to understand. She'd been taking the same measurements in her cases and finding the same impossible results. We'd sit in my office after hours, reviewing the data, looking for some pattern that would make sense of it all. "What if," she said one evening in mid-December, "what if we've had it wrong this entire time? What if death isn't the clean biological endpoint we've been taught it is?" I didn't answer her, because I was thinking the same thing, and I didn't want to say it out loud. I'd spent my entire adult life studying death, documenting it, testifying about it in court with absolute certainty about time of death, cause of death, manner of death. The idea that there might be aspects of death that science couldn't measure, couldn't explain, couldn't fit into our neat categories. It undermined everything I'd built my identity around. On January 9th, I examined the body of Rebecca Martinez, a 29-year-old woman who died in a car accident. Multiple traumatic injuries, clear cause of death. When I lifted her heart from her chest cavity, it was warm, 97.1 degrees. I stood there holding it, feeling its impossible heat against my gloved hands, and something in me finally broke. I gently placed the organ back in her chest, told Marlene Butler I wasn't feeling well, and walked out of the examination suite. I took the elevator up to the administrative offices, walked into Dr. Letier's office without knocking, and told him I was finished. "I need to step away from this, James," I said. "I can't continue doing this work when I don't understand what I'm documenting anymore." He tried to convince me to take a temporary leave, suggested I speak with the department psychologist, reminded me of my decades of excellent service, but I knew I couldn't return. I'd lost something essential for this work, the certainty that I understood what I was looking at when I examined a body. Without that certainty, I was just a man cutting open corpses and pretending to explain what had happened to them. I submitted my formal notice on January 15th. My final day at the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's office was February 7th, 2025. I cleaned out my office, said goodbye to colleagues who'd been my professional family for decades, and walked out of that gray concrete building for the final time. Stacy Kaler was the last person I spoke to. She was still documenting the temperature anomalies in her cases, still searching for an explanation. I told her I hoped she'd find one, but I didn't believe she would. It's been 4 weeks since I left. I've been spending my days reading, taking long walks, trying to figure out what comes next for someone who dedicated their entire adult life to a profession they no longer trust themselves to practice. I think about David Kowalski's warm heart, about Amanda Peterson's lungs, about all those other organs maintaining their impossible heat. I think about the thousands of autopsies I performed over 3 decades, confident that I was documenting objective truth about how these people had died. And I wonder how many other cases I missed, how many other impossible things I failed to notice because I wasn't looking for them, because my training had taught me they couldn't exist. I wonder if every medical examiner in every morgue in every city is making the same confident pronouncements I made, while something unexplainable is happening right there on their examination tables. Invisible because we've all agreed it can't be real. The truth is, I don't know what those warm organs mean. I don't know if they represent some biological process we haven't discovered yet, or something else entirely, something that falls outside the boundaries of what science can measure. What I do know is that I spent 29 years absolutely certain I understood death, and now I'm not certain of anything at all. And that uncertainty, more than anything else I encountered in that examination room, is what finally made it impossible for me to continue doing the work I'd once loved.